Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us for the first time. My name is Laura Mariko Heifetz, and I am the Assistant Dean of Admissions, Vocation, and Stewardship over at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Tonight's event, film screening and panel discussion on Far East Deep South, is sponsored by the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative of Vanderbilt Divinity School, Vanderbilt University Department of Communication Studies, Peabody College of Education and Human Development at Vanderbilt University, the UCLA Alumni Rose Bowl Bruins, and the Asian Pacific Alumni of UCLA Network. For our panel today, the moderator will ask the panelists some questions, including questions from you. For those of you joining live by YouTube, please feel free to use the comment function to the right of your screen to share reactions or ask questions of the panelists. My colleagues, Sophia Agtrap and proud Bruin Justine Chen, will be the chat moderators and keep track of your questions. We acknowledge that this is neither the first nor the last conversation about Asians in America and Asian Americans. We must have, as people located on Indigenous land, and so we would like to do a couple of land acknowledgements before we begin. The Office of Admissions at Vanderbilt Divinity School joins the Vanderbilt student government in collectively acknowledging that Vanderbilt University occupies the ancestral hunting and traditional lands of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek peoples. Today, these people have nation boundaries in Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Mississippi, after the Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced removal of Southern tribes to the west of the Mississippi River. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the Treaty of Hopewell. We recognize and support the Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those forcibly removed from their homelands. We also recognize the resistance, strength, and pride of other people of color, whose ancestors worked, lived, and bled on this land without benefit or due compensation. We come alongside you as accomplices in the fight for equity. As a land grant institution, the UCLA Alumni Association acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovaaga, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. We pay our respects to the Honukvatam ancestors, Hihirom elders, and Yohinkim, our relatives or relations, past, present, and emerging. I am delighted to welcome all of you to this special event. And I would like to introduce you to the moderator for this evening, Dr. Nancy Wong Yoon, a proud UCLA alumna, double alumna. She is a sociologist, author, and media expert on the PBS documentary series, Asian Americans. We have 4 panelists for this evening. The filmmakers, Larissa Lam is the director, writer, and producer of this film. She has produced and directed other film projects and is an award-winning singer, songwriter, speaker, and TV radio host. Baldwin Chiu is a producer of the film and is a rapper, actor, speaker, and podcaster. Additionally, we would like to welcome Dr. Ben Tran, Associate Professor of Asian Studies and English at Vanderbilt University. And last but not least, Dr. Min Zhou, Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies at the University of California at Los Angeles and Director of the UCLA Asia Pacific Center. And I am happy to turn it over to Dr. Yoon. Take it away.
Just happy to be here, and as part of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, UCLA Alumni Association, Rose Bowl Bruins, and Asian Pacific Alumni of UCLA. They are all pleased to partner with Vanderbilt University for the film screening and panel discussion of Far East Deep South. So just wanted to put that out there, and excited to be here. Excited because I know almost all the people here, and meeting Dr. Tran is an honor, and just excited to talk about this film. I saw it last night. I was crying. I don't know if other people were able to shed tears. I kind of cry a lot now especially during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, but I was just so moved by this story. So I wanted to start off with a question for Baldwin. So for you, this is a family story first, right? And for us, this was a story of Asians in America. And I wanted to know, what did you learn about kind of Asian Americans through telling your personal family story?
I think as an Asian American, I think I always struggled with finding my place in this country, not knowing when I was American and when maybe I wasn't, or maybe I was more Chinese than other times. So this discovery really allowed me, and I think also my family, to really discover how American we really are. And it was such a fantastic journey to be able to take my father along on the ride, because I think for a long time he had a struggle with his own identity as well, especially not knowing who his father was.
Without also giving up your Chinese side of your heritage, is embracing your heritage, but understanding that your family belongs very much in this country.
Right.
And what was it like? Actually, I was really curious about the fact that your father had this really emotional journey. And what was it like filming, this question, like the decision of telling this very intimate story, and maybe concern over, the emotional impact it had? Because I was living through your father, because I myself realized that my immigrant story, even though it wasn't because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was the separation of family, because immigration law does that to families, right? And so what was it like emotionally to kind of take your father and watch him, cry on camera and all of that?
So certainly that was an experience. It's not something I saw very often, my father being emotional. And also I think we saw it change. We saw his sentiment evolve from the beginning when we started the journey.
Well, and it was just a family vacation, honestly. Mm-hmm. I mean, we were rolling cameras because we have a daughter, and, just like any good parents, you're on a family vacation, you're rolling video, and we didn't know we were going to find a Bible in the middle of Mississippi, and that he was going to find all these artifacts. I mean, we were just supposed to visit a gravesite that we didn't even know where exactly it was. But at the end of the day, as you saw in the film, so many events happened. And for him, it just stretched on even beyond that first trip, all the way to the National Archives, and when he made additional discoveries. And so, we were rolling camera because we wanted to just capture these moments as a family. And at some point, when I saw the story was a little bit bigger than us, it was about the history that most of us don't know, that we're not taught in schools. And it was about just his journey reconciling the past. We definitely brought in more of the crew, but I was a little stealth with him with the camera.
As a little bit disclaimer, everything you guys saw on the film was basically, like, if this was happening real time and you were watching those interviews with my father, you would have learned about my father before I would have, because basically my dad would not talk to me or my brother about what happened. So whenever
he likes me better.
Yeah. So basically Larissa kicked me out, said, go away. I'm going to go talk to your dad. And I didn't know any of the stories that Larissa uncovered in the film and all that until after we came back to LA, and I was listening to playback, and I had no idea all those stories.
Well, so the key is always be filming, because it could be a story.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we were filming that I didn't even anticipate using in the film, because I was just trying to get an understanding of, like, when we're looking at the photo albums in that scene, and he was taking a trip down memory lane, but originally it was just so I knew what photos to use when we did put the film together. But some of the stories he was telling himself was just so compelling. I ended up throwing a lot of that footage in the film, because people were like, we love Charles. We want more Charles. What is he thinking? What is he feeling? And so you have Charles in his raw moments.
So I want to ask Professor Minjo about how common is Baldwin's father Charles' story about how the Chinese Exclusion Act and immigration laws affect Chinese American families.
Well, I just want to comment on what Baldwin just said, because it resonates with my students' experience, and also with my surprise the first time when I hear from my students. I taught a Chinese immigration class, and it's a big class. I always ask the students to interview a Chinese immigrant, whether it's their relative or not. So, and those oral history report is very moving. And then some of the students told me that that is a transformative experience, because that was the first ever time they had a conversation with their father. So that surprised me, right? And then later on, when I taught that class, that experience get repeated. So that's one. And then when I was seeing this film, I personally feel very connected to it. Like, first of all, I was from, uh, Baldwin's father's original place, right? The next county. I was from Zhongshan, and your father is from Xinhui. And then second, I also, lived in Louisiana before. I lived in the Deep South before. And when I taught Chinese immigration, I used a text by James Lowen, the Mississippi Chinese. So I had access to that part of the history early on. I was lucky because of my job. And and another common thing, typical thing is about your grandfather's name, right? It's Lao. Lao is his given name, and that is very typical of the time when a lot of Chinese immigrants came and had their name messed up by immigration officers. So the given name become their last name, and then also you have the paper son phenomenon, that you are taking on somebody else's identity in order to migrate, as a way to counter Chinese exclusion. So I remember growing up, when I was in China. Growing up, we have this swear thing. Like, if I'm not telling you the truth, I would reverse my name in writing. So now everybody has to reverse their name in writing, right? So your first name come first, and last family name come last. But in Chinese, it's the opposite. So that is very very typical of the experience. So it's quite emotional too. And I cried too when I was seeing the story, seeing that your father is crying, and I cry because my grandfather was also an immigrant, and he returned to China after the war to die. Um, so there was that story that the grandfather, husband and wife get separated. So that is also very typical and very common in pre-World War II Chinese community because of Chinese exclusion.
For the record, Professor Zhou, I'm actually from Zhongshan. My dad's side of the family is from Zhongshan.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So in the old days, those who are coming to America are mainly from the Pearl River Delta area in South China. So Zhongshan and Sanwei, that's the Pearl River Delta area. But then many more people are concentrated on just 4 counties around Zhongshan and Sanwei.
Great. So what's lesser known about Chinese American history is the South, right? And actually, the first time I think I heard about it was Professor Zhou sharing the Mississippi Chinese. It's kind of like a shock, right, to know that there were Chinese, and you did this beautifully in the movie, taking us as the audience, kind of like, what were the Chinese doing in Mississippi? And then you see this really rich history. And I want to ask Dr. Tran to tell us about that history, and how does it differ from Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in the coastal areas?
Hi, it's great to be here and great to see all of you. I too was born in Louisiana, in the backwaters in Cajun land, west of New Orleans, and I grew up in New Orleans, and then Atlanta. And then I went to California for grad school, but I was a Berkeleyan, so I'm the outlier here in terms of UCLA. But now I'm back in the South and in Nashville. And to answer your question, I would say there's a history of the need for labor after the abolition of slavery in the American South of cheap labor. And so the Chinese were brought over in addition to the Transcontinental Railroad, and that was a source of it. And the idea of coolies that some scholars have written about have been very significant in the development of the South and that identity. And the entrepreneurship that comes from the limited available possibilities of being Chinese American, Asian American in the South is there. One of the biggest differences, I think, between the coastal areas, clearly population. The Asian American population in the South is more transitory. They left, or their children come and go, and we see that even with the Vietnamese community, like in Versailles, New Orleans, Louisiana, what Dr. Zhou has written about. But that's changing now, because I think as these cities begin to grow, these southern cities begin to grow. They say Atlanta has LA traffic without the benefits of LA. And of course, the Asian American population has played a significant role in the last year's national election, for example. But I think it's transitory. The populations are smaller. That is changing. But I think in terms of what's compelling about this film to me are the archival materials that were available, that were unearthed as your family began to meet all these people, and everyone started to come out and talk about this, and the photographs and the news clippings and even the letterhead I thought was amazing. But I think that the biggest difference then is that the archival materials are here, the history is here, but the transmission, the means of transmission is not here. I think that's what all of us are trying to do, be it through events like this. Ethnic studies is big on the West Coast. It's not big in universities in the South, be they public or private. The built environments are different. The cities here are exit or more car driven, exits off the highway. So you don't see a concentration of Asian Americans. And as the cities gentrify, like Atlanta, people go to their different exits. So that's not visible. So there's the built environment and the transmission of that history I think we need to work on. And that I would say is the biggest differences.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Ben is saying. By the way, I also love New Orleans, and I did a study on the Vietnamese community over there that you mentioned. So one of the key difference I think between the Asians in the South and in the Deep South and also on the coasts is the ethnic community. Because on both coasts, in New York and the West Coast, there is a very long-standing, very well-structured ethnic community that the immigrants, even among those who lack language and language ability, and that they could get help, they could connect. Whereas in the South, in the old days, nowadays it's transforming, right? There are a lot of professional immigrants from Asia coming. But in the old days, those who are lacking language skills and also lacking the kind of job skills to get job here, they would move to the coast, right, where their ethnic communities are, to provide them with jobs. So for those who stay, a lot of them are running small businesses to survive and work on their family businesses. So in the old days, that is a key difference. Like in the South, you are either owners of small businesses or workers of your own family business, and then with a few kids. But most of the workers, they would transit. They would be in transit back to where their ethnic communities are. Now, today it's very different. The places like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that historically is not the destination for Asians. Now there are a lot of Asian people moving there. They are both professionals as well as workers, because Asian businesses also take in a lot of low-skilled workers as well.
I think about how Asian Americans are kind of, in the U.S. racial hierarchy, in between Black and white. This documentary, and oftentimes we're seen as pitted, right? That pitted against either group. But I like the way that this documentary really shows how the Black and Asian community, or Black and Chinese community in this particular documentary in the South came together. So maybe Larissa, can you talk about why you decided to focus on that in the documentary?
Yeah, it's one of the surprising things we discovered. I mean, I'm an LA girl. I grew up in Diamond Bar, California, went to UCLA. And so my backdrop and historical knowledge of, Asian Black is tainted by some of the tensions historically that have been among our community. And so, hearing that the Chinese were forced to live, outside of the white neighborhoods, which meant that we're living among the Black neighbors, I was kind of curious, like, oh, well, how did the Black community feel about this? Because we know kind of how they feel in some of the more urban centers. Surprised to find out there was such a welcoming and respectful relationship. Again, time period does matter. So we are talking about early 1900s, right? And during segregation, Jim Crow, where these two communities had to rely on each other to kind of survive and work their way around the system that was in place to kind of marginalize and oppress them. And so the fact that we heard those stories about Baldwin's grandfather and great-grandfather and every Chinese store being a welcoming place for the African-American neighbors to shop, because they could walk through the front door and not have to worry about going through a back entrance. And the Chinese also had to use the quote unquote colored entrance as well. And so this was very, very surprising to us, but also a very pleasant surprise.
Yeah, we show up there the first time in the film, and we actually didn't meet really any members of the Black community on that first trip. But next time we went out there, we had been introduced to the mayor, Lavon Jackson. And when we show up, instead of seeing nobody there, we see the entire town of Pace.
And it's still
there.
Predominantly,
it's predominantly black. And they were having a big party. It was like Oktoberfest party, barbecue, ribs, everything's going on. And that platform that you see in the film that's on my grandfather's property was like a stage. And they had me and Larissa go up there and we performed, we rapped and beatboxed and sang. And then all of a sudden they bring us down and they give us all this food. And then they bring our, us plus Emerald Dunn, who was with us, so 3 Chinese people, and our 2 or 3 white camera guys, right? Invite us all into the mayor's house, and he just said,
he home cooked some ribs,
whole spread, ribs, corn,
Southern
ribs,
hospitality
everything,
is
right?
real.
And it was like we didn't even feel like outsiders. We felt like we were in the family, and it was an amazing experience to be like the first time we meet him. It's like he invites us to his home.
Well, and I think personally as music artists, because that's what our background was before we did the documentary, we both felt a very strong connection to the Black culture, because as Asian Americans, it's like we didn't have other Asian American artists to look up to. And so, he's a rapper and I do R&B, jazz and, pop. And so all our favorite artists, were Black. And so I think for us to know that his great grandfather and grandfather had such a strong, connection to the community there. I think that kind of changed our perspective on, I think, Asian and Black relationships.
Yeah. And certainly hearing them want to talk about that experience. We were afraid that they didn't want to talk to us. We were afraid that they would be like, oh, we don't really want to, that's probably not a topic we really want to share about. But they were so open and they were so kind to like share whatever they could.
And we're still in touch with, a lot of, actually everyone that you see in the film.
Yeah. Except unfortunately a couple of them have passed on. But that's also the sign of the times. They were getting older and the generations were getting older. But it was incredible that they could be older but still recall when they were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that impact that they had going into the grocery stores with their parents. It's pretty amazing.
And what about the scholars? Could you weigh in on the kind of history of Black-Asian relations in the South?
Well, I should say, when I lived in Baton Rouge, my next door neighbor is Black. So we got to have the opportunity of interacting with them at very intimate level, and we exchange food, exchange things, childcare, and then also parties, right? We just cross the fence at the backyard and go to the party. And everybody was like talking about Southern hospitality, and we experienced that during the time we lived there. So that's that. And then also, I was very moved by actually seeing the scene in the film, in the documentary about, Black and Chinese interaction, like the family is welcomed by, the Black community. So from the book Mississippi Chinese, that book particularly focused on Chinese and Black relations, because the title is Mississippi Chinese Between Black and White. So personally, seeing the interaction, seeing the scene, seeing the interviews, that brings all the reading material to reality, to real. So that's a very moving scene to me. And I believe if my students who have read James Lowen's book and taken my class, they would have the same feeling. And then historically, the Chinese, they are operating stores and they are like middlemen. But unlike today's middlemen minorities who operate stores that has the potential for interracial conflict, during that time, and also at the time of segregation, actually the Chinese and Black community are interacting very well with one another. And then the Chinese, the store owners were the only one who could provide for the Black community, extend credit to the Black community. A lot of families are very poor. They don't have a lot of disposable income, so that is kind of the interdependent relationship. Also is very common there, as well as interracial marriage. And there are interracial marriage, there are mixed race children too. However, when the mixed race children are coming of age, they are more kind of ostracized by the Chinese community and excluded by the Chinese community than by the Black community. Like they are accepted by the African American community, accepted them, but not the Chinese community. So in a way, as the Chinese are becoming assimilating, they are assimilating into the white dominant culture, and they take on the systemic racism, and they are influenced at that as well.
So I'll just add that this relationship between the African American community and the Asian American community in southern areas are still going on. For example, the bodegas in Louisiana are run by Vietnamese entrepreneurs who live in predominantly African American neighborhoods, or Korean store owners who have beauty supply stores or whatnot in African American neighborhoods. So that interdependence of the availability of what's business opportunities and income availability is around is still permanent today, in a sense, in that segregation de jure has ended. But I think in the South, I think cities in particular, and even some of the rural areas, are still divided along those old lines, and that's still present. So that is there. And I wanted to emphasize one aspect between the Asian American community and the African American community, which is say that it's interrelational, and they help define each other and help nuance how we understand these relationships. Right? The difference between coolie labor versus chattel slavery labor, right? The differences between the possibilities of entrepreneurship or owning land and needing credit, right? So these relationships really help us understand in a more nuanced way how racism works in America systemically, and how we can work together to overcome. And really, what I like about this film is that there's a celebration. What I love about the film is this. It was so interesting to me that the first half of the film, all the white people that you interviewed, they spoke of your grandfather so lovingly, but race was never mentioned, right? But then immediately, I think it's like the 43rd minute of the film, where you start interviewing in your second visit your African American interviewees, and they talk about race in a very open, blunt, more realistic way. And I think that is one of the crucial aspects of this. And there are cultural connections, particularly of music, that you can see, especially in where I was born in the Cajun area, of Asian Americans, African Americans. And I think we should celebrate that more often.
Mhm. Mhm.
I just want to say I love how you keep bringing back Louisiana. So something we did not reveal in the film was that my great grandfather actually made his way into Louisiana first from San Francisco through New Orleans and Baton Rouge, eventually making his way up to Memphis, where they were doing a lot of recruitment and stuff, and then eventually trickled himself back down the Mississippi River and settled in Pace. But it's kind of cool to hear, all these stories about Louisiana, and it jives with our family history as well.
We have to do a field trip there one day.
So we have some audience questions. One that I also want to know, and the scene where Charlie sees his father's Bible. I mean, that was probably the first tears that I shed, and just the question is, did Charlie get to keep his father's Bible, and how is Charlie?
Well, the good thing is that the Bible was returned to us, and so we actually own the Bible now. But then what we did was we put it back on loan with the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum so that they can continue to take care of the Bible and have it on display so other people can enjoy it as well.
And in a pre-pandemic world, we originally thought when we released the film, we would maybe have a traveling exhibit with the Bible and other artifacts from the museum. We hope to still maybe mount something like that, as things have been opening up more down the line. But if you go down to the Cleveland, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum and look up Emily Jones, our curator, and you want to see the Bible, I can't remember if it's on display or if it's in the back, because they change their displays out all the time. So she will show it to you.
My dad, he's doing okay. He's slower than he was in the film.
And he's probably watching right now.
He's probably watching right now. But we're trying to keep him in good health. He's definitely getting older, but we love him, and he's been very emotional with all the attention to the film. And
he watched so our broadcast premiere on PBS was last week, like on live TV. He's watched, I think, almost every airing of it. Like, he woke up at 5 a.m. in the morning. He has the DVD, but he still wanted to wake up to watch the live airing of the film.
I think that kind of answers your previous question as well on how he's doing. He's transformed from the beginning of this journey to where it is right now. Whereas before, definitely very private. Even today, he's got some hesitance, like, wow, all these people are watching me get emotional, and we know that doesn't normally happen. And in fact, you see my brother putting his arm around my dad in that scene. You can see that the hesitance in my brother too. Like, do I put my arm around him? Like, what's he doing?
Your brother said this was the first time when we found the Bible. It was the first time your brother had ever seen.
Yeah, he was like, "Oh, he's crying. What do I do?" Right? And now my dad is definitely more emotional. He says he loves us. We talk about the significance of the film, and he just loves whereas before he wouldn't want people to really know about his private life. Whereas now he's like, maybe it's okay.
He's still not 100% comfortable, but he's okay with the historical value in it. He understands the impact that the film is making.
And then another audience question is for Larissa and Baldwin in terms of structuring the film. How did you decide to do that in terms of chapters? Was most of the work done at the editing table?
Oh, there's lots
Good
of editing. A shout out to our editor, Dwight Bueller, for like the 5 years that we worked together on this film. What I wanted to do was take the audience through our family's experience. And so chapter 1 was the backstory, in a sense, of why we had to go to Mississippi. And so that's why it started out with, it being the immigrant story. And that's kind of how we viewed. I think Baldwin's family viewed themselves as an immigrant family when we started this journey. And then when we get to Mississippi, especially when after the first trip, we dive deeper into the Southern story, and we get to meet all the other residents in there. And again, that's how things developed. The first trip, we only met the few people there. And then once we started to plunge into all this, we met historians, we met all these other local residents who had connections, and we wanted the audience to learn the history history as we were learning it as well. And so that's why the Southern story was the second chapter. And then we thought we were done with the film. There's a shot of Baldwin like walking along some cotton field. That was originally supposed to be the final shot,
the money shot
of the film. In October of 2016, I thought like, okay, this is a Southern story. It's about your family in Mississippi. And then we go to San Francisco in the National Archives when somebody said, have you seen your grandparents or your grandfather and great-grandparents' exclusion files? And we said, what are those? And we had no idea the National Archives back in San Francisco, where you were born. We had to go all the way to Mississippi to make it back to San Francisco to discover this other part. And that's when we find the birth certificate for your great-grandfather. And then we realized how many generations had been in the country. And then it became an American story. And that ended up reframing kind of the whole film. So that's kind of the progression of the 3 chapters, that ultimately you're not watching a Chinese American story. You're not watching an Asian American story. You are watching an American family and an American story.
When I felt really emotional also when you found out that your great grandfather was actually born in the United States, right? That was that correct? And he's the first one to be born. And someone in my family asked, why is that so significant? And I was like, I couldn't immediately answer. I was like, it just is to know someone, that you're not the first. And could you say a little bit more about what you felt, and your family felt in learning that, that you had a history here in the United States in terms of someone being born here way before you?
Yeah, I mean, all my life growing up, I was kind of proud of being the first one in my family to be born in America. Like, hey, I'm the first, right? And there's always something that feels good about being the first. And when we learned about the birth certificate, I think one of the first things we thought was, is it fake, right? And then once we dug in deeper and found other documents, we're like, wow, this is probably legit, right? And then I was thinking, oh man, I'm not the first. But then, and I was a little disappointed. But then I was thinking, oh man, I am not the first. And then it became excitement, like because up to that point, I kind of mentioned it earlier, I was always conflicted. Like the beginning of the movie starts off with like, people ask me, where are you from? Or where are you really from? And I always thought, well, that's a legitimate question, because you probably just figure I'm not from here. Because if I looked at myself, I probably think I'm not from here either, right? But after the birth certificate, and then I counted generations, because now we can count my great-great-grandfather, right? Because he was here before in order to be able to give birth to his son, right? Mm-hmm. I was like, then I look at my daughter, I'm like, that's 6 generations. Why should I not feel American? Why should
treat you not as American?
Yeah,
right?
Why should people even assume that I'm not American? Or and when my daughter gets older, I mean, is it going to take 6 generations for her to finally be accepted? So I think it really started changing me, and I felt like, well, this can't be just me. Like my great grandfather can't be the only one that was born here in America, right? So how many other thousands are in the same situation, or maybe extending even further? Whereas today, people still look at us as if we're foreign. It totally changed my whole outlook on who I am and where I belong.
Yeah, you can go like, I'm more American than you. No, it doesn't matter what generation you are.
No, it doesn't.
You are.
But it did put that effect in me. Like it definitely changed the way I felt about my belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love how the story makes the Chinese Exclusion Act so visceral, because I think when I teach about it, I'm like, it's 18 in the 1800s. That seems like so long ago. But here in your family story, it's so visceral. And I wonder if the scholars can talk about how the Chinese Exclusion Act still affects us to this day.
Well, yes, it affects us profoundly. Baldwin had already mentioned about the perception of Asians as non-American, right? The identity issue that has an impact on it too. And the Chinese Exclusion Act, there is profound effect on American society of the time. At that time, it was the Chinese Exclusion Act is kind of heightened who Americans are. It's everybody but not you, right? Everybody but you. So setting one group up for exclusion is to reaffirm the American identity, who belong to that nation and who is not. So that has a great effect. And also the Chinese Exclusion Act, after its passage, it's the first and only act that excludes people based on the national origin, right? So it's kind of our shameful history. And then, at the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, immigration, the bureaucracy is getting set up after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in 1882, the passage of Chinese Exclusion Act, and then the government established the Bureau of Customs, and also, it sets the border. And then 1885, because 1882, the Exclusion Act, 1892 got extended for another 10 years, and later on it extended infinitely. So the government established another bureaucracy, the Chinese division of the Bureau of Immigration. So that has also another bureaucracy that controls immigration, not just Chinese immigration, later on also Asian immigration. And then later it's, the point is, the Chinese Exclusion Act also set off the establishment of the U.S. bureaucracy in controlling immigration, particularly Asian immigration. And then the impact on the Asian community is even more profound. So Baldwin's family is 6th generation, but how many of those are 6th generation? In the greater Chinese community today, we have been here longer than a lot of other groups, including Italians and Eastern Europeans. But we are still predominantly the 1st generation and the 2nd generation. 1st generation, like 2/3 of the community is 1st generation immigrants like me. Why is that? Why is that 6th generation so thin, like 6th generation so thin? Whereas Japanese Americans, they have been here like a whole generation later than us, but because of different exclusion, right? They managed to have a natural growth in their community, but the Chinese community is stifled the natural population growth. So that has a profound impact on us, right? That even today we are still predominantly the immigrant community. And the other profound impact, I think, Baldwin's family is also, illustrative, is family separation. And we have a very common phenomenon of a split household family. Like, there is a bachelor's society here in the US, but they are not bachelors. They are married men with families back home. And also they have to raise families back home and not able to bring their children here. So that family separation has profound impact on the community. And then, for the positive side, the community, organize themselves for survival. So Chinatown is a product of exclusion. And then with the ethnic economy and, ethnic social organizations. So that also, persists today in the community. I can be on and on, but I stand safe.
Yeah, Dr. Chiu has done a great job with that, and it is true that this is the initial case of racialization of Asian immigrants to exclude them from citizenry, and the immigration process and documents and policing. We begin to see this happening, and this is why birth certificates and so forth become so important. But the other thing that we should think about too, that comes to tell us that U.S. citizenship was understood or carved out in concrete, bureaucratic, political ways vis-a-vis what the Chinese labors were perceived to be, right? So in this instance, it's very significant for us to think about the history of Asian America as being one that is very political, more so than just cultural, right? And so if we understand Asian American history as one being political, and in this case, in a negative way towards American citizenship, and this is a question that's been raised up in our chat box that I'm saying is, this is a part of US history, right? The audience for this film, I think, would behoove not only Asian Americans watching this, but all Americans to watch this, to understand how we've come to police, to define, and to kind of narrow our understanding of what a U.S. citizen is in our immigration policies that we see with child separation. And I think the other thing that we're seeing, and we're returning this again, is the scapegoating of all political problems and issues on the foreign Asian or the foreign Asian body, right? Be it the pandemic, be it the shortage of jobs. We begin to see it even with the Biden administration, this kind of anti-Chinese rhetoric that has repercussions here in the United States, with the ongoing anti-Asian, anti-AAPI hate crimes that we're seeing. So this is a prevalent history that we've seen that affects us still to this day. Not only Asian Americans, but all other immigrant groups, subsequent different Asian ethnic groups, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Pacific Islanders, and so forth, but also other immigrant communities that are being policed and watched. And this was the precedent by which we've come to understand or redefine and bring into greater relief and reality these policies.
Well, I'm learning so much about the impact, and it's so true because I think there's more and more interest in this history, right? Because of this rise in, and not new, but just uptick once again because of the pandemic and all sorts of, like Dr. Chan said, all sorts of, I think, anti-Asia fear that then trickles over to our population here. Which goes back to, the where are you really from? We are from here, but you always see us from there. And so anyway, so another question about about Asia, right? Have you done any research for the filmmakers in Xinhui? Is this right, Xinhui? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes, you're right.
Okay, for more about the family that was left behind. I mean, I was curious about, was it the sister and another.
It gets complicated. So Xinhui is the Mandarin spelling for pinyin for Sunwoi, which is the Cantonese pronunciation of the same city that Baldwin's father was born and the rest of his family was from. And we have done a little bit of digging with the help of My China Roots, a family history organization that's doing research for those of Chinese ancestry. So there are relatives still in existence, and that's again a byproduct of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Baldwin has never met his cousins and doesn't know them. Maybe one day, we'll get to go to the village, but there, at this point, there's.
Yeah, I mean, we would love to go back there. We had My China Roots did do some research for us, so we have a little bit of information, but definitely maybe when pandemic opens, things are opening back up, we can make our way over there. But I think one of the things that this brings up is like, the Chinese exclusions, how it affected our family is kind of like how my dad grew up in China thinking that he was abandoned, right? And certainly there are other family members in China, not just from our family, that we've heard stories from other families where they don't understand what the Chinese Exclusion Act is in America. So they just assume that their fathers went to America, to the milk of, land of milk and honey, the mountain of gold, to have
the women and the girls that got left behind.
Right. And the women and girls get left behind, and they think, oh, the guys just are having a great time in America, and they blame them for leaving them behind. But in reality, like you saw in the film, my grandfather really missed my dad, and he tried really hard, and so those are the unintended consequences of something like the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah, there's another question about, I guess the question is, how did your grandfather come, or this is maybe not your grandfather, but the great grandfather, right? I'm sorry, to come to be born in the U.S. And when Charles was a boy in China, did Casey send money home and have any communication with him? I am curious about, because he was able to have his son there, and I wonder if it was because he was born in the U.S. Right? This is the whole, like, how does one generation is able to have some sort of reunification, and then the next generation not? And this probably has to do with the laws being passed at the time that they did.
Yeah. So what we know is, based on our research and the records that we uncovered at the National Archives, Baldwin's great-great-grandparents somehow made it here. His great-great-grandfather worked in a cigar factory in San Francisco. So a lot of people I didn't know that until I read about that. But, we didn't just work on railroads and gold mines. There was a lot of other industries around the country that the Chinese contributed labor to. And so we know that. So at some point in time, his great-grandfather was born. And then I think there was a similar question in terms of, were the Chinese women allowed to come? And the 1875 Page Act made it very difficult for women to come. So again, kind of the timeline, Baldwin's great-grandfather was born in 1877. So his great-great-grandparents would have been here in the country prior to a lot of these restrictions in place by these immigration laws. So that's why they were able to make it in before they started, clamping down.
There were more women
everything
in the 1860s than there were in the 1870s and 80s.
Yeah. And I see. Okay. So, and yes, like Baldwin's great-grandparents and grandfather, they did send money back to China.
Yes.
Yes.
And also it was very common at that time for the families, if they have young children, to send them back to China. And then once they send them back to China, if they lost their birth certificate, or they have to take a lot of ways to get the children back here in the United States. So that's why you wouldn't see the continuation of the family because of the Exclusion Act. You will see some are born here, but the next generation are not born here, are born back there. So it could also be that because women were not allowed to come, so there are also a lot of Chinese men who marry wife over there, and then they return, every so often to father their children. Like my own grandfather, I remember when I was little, I keep on asking my grandmother. I said, "How come I don't have the first uncle? My oldest uncle is my second uncle, and then I have a fourth uncle and skip two, and they are not that." But then my grandmother said, "Oh, your grandfather have another family in America." But my grandfather, diligently sent money back and then come back every so often. So that's why my father's siblings is 10, 12, 15 years apart, the three siblings. So that is the part of the exclusion act that create the split household families. And it was very common.
Well, and an interesting note, Baldwin's mother's side, we didn't really explore much of this at all in the film because we didn't know. I just assumed like she was born in Hong Kong, her family had been in China, came over, like your typical, immigrant story, until just last year you found out that your great-grandfather on your mom's side worked on the railroad and settled in Denver, Colorado. And so guess what our next project is?
Yeah.
So that's
Far East, Deep West.
Or Far East Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, so I mean, those are unfortunate stories where, like, my father benefited from being able to eventually come back, but my mom had the same situation that happened on her side of the family, where the Chinese Exclusion Act did not allow her grandfather to come back to the U.S., even though he was entitled to, even though his lawyer, a white lawyer, had also documents that we found saying you should be able to come back, but we have new laws now and they're not
because he was not born in the, and that is the difference, is because your great-grandfather was born here and he was able to make it back into the country and then eventually bring Casey Liu, your grandfather, who by derivative birthright citizenship was a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
So, what do you think, the filmmakers, in terms of representation? We talk about representation all the time. How does your film contribute to, I think that this is a story that we don't see a lot. I mean, we did see Minari, which was, a film that talked about a Korean American family in Arkansas, but first generation. This is a different kind of story, right? This is a story about being here way, way before, right?
Like the prequel to Minari, right?
Right, all the different generations of Southern Asians, right? Can you talk about how significant your story is and this film is to AAPI representation, or specifically Asian American representation?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's wonderful to be able to see narrative films that have representation, but ours being a documentary, I hope what it does is it shows that this is an authentic film. There are people that question a narrative film by saying, "Oh, you're going to throw in an Asian person.
You dramatized it.
It's not really
creative
real.
License.
You're just throwing them in for diversity's sake." And I think our film can show testament that no, we can put Asian people in whatever scenario for authenticity's sake, because we do have stories in these different regions. We do have stories in these different timelines in American history. So it's okay to put us in there, and you're not just throwing us in there for the sake of it. We have historical value, and we're actually making the film more authentic. We're making the stories more authentic and actually more believable.
Yeah, and I think what it also did is, as we did research for the film and traveled the country with our previous short film that was just Finding Cleveland, that was just about the first trip that we took to Mississippi. We found all these rich stories of other Asian American groups all around the country. I mean, we heard some of it from Dr. Tran, and obviously Louisiana, and you go to Texas, and I mean, it's not like Asians were just in California. They were all across the United States, especially post railroad. They had to go somewhere. They came to build the railroad, and so for us, the representation in media, but even more broadly for us, it's so important for us to include this in our American history. And I think I saw some comments in the chat, and that is our major goal, is that if our kids and our next generation aren't learning this in school at an earlier age as part of American history, they're not going to become the writers and the studio executives who are going to say like, oh yeah, there were Asians, in the South, so it's perfectly normal for us to have a film that casts Asians, or create a story, that has Asians in it. And so, that is our overarching goal, is that we all learn about segregation. We all learn about the American South. And currently the way history is taught in our schools, we don't learn about the contributions of the Asian American community. And there's other communities of color that have been excluded from that history. I mean, even in the Mississippi Delta, there were Lebanese, there were Mexicans, there was other people besides just Chinese, white, and black. And so that is our hope, is that a story like ours opens the door for additional stories to be told, and for people to really broaden the way we discuss American history.
And if you're going to put an Asian person in a film that has an accent, it might as well be a Southern one.
Not an Asian one. Oh, I've seen so many castings with an Asian accent, Southern accent, totally legit.
When people say do an accent, actors should come out with a Southern accent.
My 10-year-old son, when he moved out of Louisiana, we moved from Louisiana to New York, and then he has a heavy Southern accent. Yeah,
and it's real.
but I really applaud your effort to uncover the hidden history, and it's very important. And talking about representation, our history have been hidden and silenced for so long, and now it's time to really dig up the history. And your family history really matches the American history timeline. So that's very authentic, and also it tells an American story. And I applauded you doing the effort, and go Bruins.
Yes, thank you. Do I do it 8 o'clock now?
So, Larissa, there was one question also about how can everyday people start to document their own family, and Baldwin as well. How do we? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'll find someone in my in my long history. I just assume I'm the first one into this country, but you never know, right?
You never know.
So how does the average person start to kind of explore that personal history for Asian Americans?
Yeah, well, first off, we always encourage people, if you still have parents and grandparents or aunts and uncles alive, find an opportunity to just start talking with them. And one of the great things about our film, especially this month, it's available to stream on PBS. It's like, we know sometimes it's an awkward conversation to start. So maybe it's like, hey, I've got this great film that you can watch. And then it's kind of a shared experience of watching the film that you can now have a catalyst for conversation where you're like, well, what about your story? I want to hear more about, your family. Because I know sometimes, especially Asian parents can be a little bit reticent to kind of share, or, even just that older generation, regardless of your ethnic background, is sometimes a little locked up. So get your iPhones, all have like voice memos, just hit record, have that conversation with them, or video camera, or whatever it happens to be. That's an easy way to start.
Yeah, and also on our website, fareastdeepsouth.com, we have a resources page where we also link to genealogy sites and some of the talks that we had about how we conducted our research, how to go about to like the National Archives, and how they're starting to digitize a lot of the documents. And the National Archives is public. It's a government it's a government owned, but it's public to everyone. So you own it, as an American. And so you can go do your research there. You can find your family history. Certainly, Dr. Zhou was talking about the names, and that was one of our hurdles, was finding out how to spell our names and which came first, the Chiu or the Lu, and why and when. And do you spell Lu this way, or do you spell Lu that way? You spell Chiu this way, or you spell it with a J, Jiu, right? So finding those complexities and working with an archivist and with some of the genealogy places gives you a lot of help.
And I'll give you a tip. So on May 25th, we are going to be doing a family history panel around our film. And we have several genealogy experts who are going to be someone from Family Search, someone who used to work for the National Archives. So if this is an area that you're curious to learn more about, we encourage you to go to our website, fareastdeepsouth.com. We've posted a little bit of information. We'll have registration opening up, but you can subscribe to our newsletter or follow us on social media. And we'd love for you to join us in that conversation, because I know so many people are inspired to go find their roots after they watch our film. And we hope you tell your stories too.
Yeah, it's hard for us to tell all 5 years of our research in like 5 minutes. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you to Professor Zhou and Professor Tran. And just it's been just such a lovely conversation. And I'm going to turn this back to Pastor Laura.
Thank you so much to these fabulous panelists, and thank you all who attended this session. One of the best weapons against anti-Asian and anti-Asian American racism and violence is knowing our own histories and our own racial identities, and understanding that solidarity is an ongoing project of accountable relationships with other minoritized communities. So thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. I would like to leave us with a quote from activist Yuri Kochiyama. Just remember that what you put on your pedestal will be your main influence in your life. I am hoping you place love for your family, friends, and humanity, service to your community, concern for human rights, justice, and human dignity on your pedestal. And please show appreciation to friends old and new. The precious, intangible gems like happiness, satisfaction, self-respect, and pride, they are the thanks to the people who come into your life. Life is not what you alone make it. Life is the input of everyone who touched your life and every experience that entered it. We are all part of one another. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.